On the morning of the 16th of April, 1746, on a bleak and wind-scoured moor in the Scottish Highlands, one of the most consequential battles in British history lasted less than an hour. By the time the smoke cleared over Culloden Moor, the Jacobite cause was finished. The Highland way of life was entering its death throes, and a cultural catastrophe was set in motion that would echo through the centuries. This is the story of the 45, the Battle of Culloden, and the brutal reckoning that followed. To understand Culloden, you need to understand what the Jacobites were actually fighting for. When James II of England and the 7th of Scotland was deposed in the Glorious Revolution of 1688, he fled to France and left behind a cause. His supporters, called Jacobites from the Latin Jacobus for James, believed the Stuart line was the only legitimate royal house of Britain. They didn't just disappear after 1688. They simmered for decades, organized in drawing rooms and taverns, and launched multiple risings. In 1689, 1708, 1715, and 1709, each one ultimately failing to restore the Stuarts to power. By 1745, the Stuart pretender was Charles Edward Stuart, known to his supporters as Bonnie Prince Charlie and to his enemies simply as the Young Pretender. He was 24 years old, handsome, charismatic, and utterly convinced that if he just showed up in Scotland, the clans would rise, England would follow, and the throne would be his. In July 1745, with no army, almost no money, and just 7 companions, he landed on the Hebridean island of Erskay and made his gamble. And for a while, it worked. The Highland clans rallied to his standard at Glenfinnan in August 1745. Within weeks, he had taken Edinburgh without a fight. At the Battle of Prestonpans, his Highland army routed a government force in under 10 minutes. Blessed with success, the Jacobite army crossed into England, reaching as far south as Derby by December, just 130 miles from London. Panic reportedly gripped the capital. King George II was said to be packing his bags. But here the dream began to unravel. The English Catholic and Jacobite support that Charles had promised his commanders never materialized. The anticipated French invasion that was supposed to sweep up the English Channel didn't come. His senior commanders, particularly the experienced Lord George Murray, urged retreat. Charles was furious, convinced they were on the cusp of victory, but he was overruled. The army turned north, and that retreat, many historians argue, was the moment the 45 was truly lost. Through the freezing winter months, the Jacobite army fell back into Scotland, winning one more engagement at Falkirk in January 1746, but slowly being ground down. The man sent to finish them was Prince William Augustus, Duke of Cumberland, the 24-year-old son of King George II. He was disciplined, methodical, and utterly ruthless. He and Charles were almost exactly the same age, and their final confrontation would define both of their legacies. By April 1746, the Jacobite army was in desperate straits. Hungry, exhausted, and unpaid, the men had been marching and fighting through a brutal winter. Charles made camp near Inverness, on Culloden Moor, a site chosen by his Irish advisor John O'Sullivan over the strenuous objections of Lord George Murray. Murray hated the ground. It was flat and open, perfect for Cumberland's artillery and disciplined infantry, and catastrophically unsuited to the Highland charge that was the Jacobite army's only real weapon. The night before the battle, in a last desperate attempt to seize the initiative, Murray led the Jacobite army on a night march to try to surprise Cumberland's camp at Nairn. It was a bold plan that collapsed in the darkness and the exhaustion of the men. They turned back, having achieved nothing, and arrived back at Culloden at dawn, barely able to stand. The government army under Cumberland arrived on the moor that morning in full fighting order, rested, fed, and numbering perhaps 8,000 men against a Jacobite force of around 5,000, they deployed with professional precision. The battle opened with a government artillery barrage. The Jacobite guns, undermanned and poorly supplied, replied weakly. For 20 to 30 agonizing minutes, cannonballs tore through the packed Highland ranks, while Charles hesitated to give the order to charge. Men fell where they stood. The tension became unbearable. When the charge finally came, it came in disorder. The right wing of the Jacobite army, led by Clan Chitan, hurtled forward and actually broke through the government front line, engaging in savage hand-to-hand fighting. The left wing, caught in boggy ground and struck by flanking fire, faltered. The second government line held. The Highland charge, the most feared assault in the British Isles for a generation, had been blunted. Cumberland's infantry had been drilled in a new tactic specifically designed to counter the charge. Rather than each soldier engaging the man directly in front of him, which left him exposed to the targe and broadsword of the man to his right, each soldier now angled his bayonet toward the unshielded side of the Highlander attacking his neighbor. It was devastatingly effective. Within 40 to 50 minutes, it was over. The Jacobite army broke and fled. Around 1,500 to 2,000 Jacobites were killed on the field and in the immediate pursuit. Government losses were perhaps 50 dead and perhaps 250 wounded. It was not a battle, it was a slaughter. What followed the battle was worse than the battle itself. Cumberland ordered his cavalry to pursue the fleeing Highlanders and give no quarter. Wounded men were killed where they lay. Houses and barns where Jacobites were sheltering were burned. Prisoners taken in the days after the battle were shot or transported. The orders were explicit, and they were followed. Cumberland earned his nickname, the Butcher, in those days after Culloden. His dispatches to London were triumphant. London celebrated. The composer George Frederick Handel wrote an oratorio in his honor. The flower Sweet William was named after him in England, though in Scotland the same flower was pointedly called Stinking Billy. Charles Edward Stuart, meanwhile, fled into the Highlands, becoming for 5 months one of the most wanted fugitives in Europe, with a reward of £30,000 on his head. Despite that extraordinary sum, a life-changing fortune for any impoverished Highlander, nobody betrayed him. He was sheltered, hidden, and guided across mountains and islands by ordinary Scots who remained loyal even at enormous personal risk. The story of Flora MacDonald, who helped smuggle him disguised as her Irish maidservant across to the island of Skye, became one of the most celebrated tales of loyalty in Scottish history. In September 1746, he escaped to France and never returned to Scotland. He died in Rome in 1788, an alcoholic embittered, his cause long dead. The military crushing of the 45 was only the beginning. The British government was determined that the Highlands would never again raise an army against the Crown, and they set about dismantling the entire structure of Highland society with systematic ferocity. The Act of Prescription of 1746 banned the wearing of Highland dress, the kilt, the plaid, the tartan. The playing of bagpipes was prohibited in some circumstances, the instrument officially designated a weapon of war. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act stripped clan chiefs of their ancient legal powers over their people, severing the bonds of loyalty and obligation that had made the clan system function. The Disarming Acts demanded that Highlanders surrender their weapons, though it was noted with some dark humor that loyal clans had already handed in their weapons after the previous rising in 1715, while the disloyal ones had kept theirs, so in practice the loyal were disarmed and the disloyal were not. Thousands of Jacobites were arrested. Around 1,000 were transported to the American colonies as indentured laborers. Around 120 were executed, including lords and officers. Men like Lord Kilmarnock and Lord Balmerino, who died on Tower Hill in London with a dignity that reportedly moved the watching crowds to tears. Some estimates suggest hundreds more died in the appalling conditions of the prison hulks and jails where prisoners were held awaiting their fates. The clan lands of those who had risen were forfeited to the Crown and placed under government management. The annexed Forfeited Estates Commission spent decades trying to transform the Highlands into something that resembled the lowland and English agricultural model. It didn't really work, but it didn't need to because something far more destructive was already underway. The Highland Clearances, the forced eviction of tenant farmers from the land their families had occupied for generations to make way for more profitable sheep, gathered pace through the late 18th and into the 19th century. While not a direct consequence of Culloden, Culloden had shattered the political and cultural infrastructure that might have resisted or slowed it. The chiefs who might once have considered themselves fathers of their people now increasingly saw themselves as landowners in the modern economic sense, and their people as an inconvenience. Communities that had survived for centuries in the glens were cleared, burned out in some cases, and shipped to the coasts, to Canada, to Australia, to America. The Gaelic language, which had already been under pressure for generations, contracted sharply. The population of the Highlands today remains a fraction of what it was in 1745. Culloden is the last pitched battle ever fought on British soil. That single fact carries enormous weight. It represents a hard, bloody full stop at the end of centuries of internal armed conflict in the British Isles. The battlefield today is managed by the National Trust for Scotland. You can walk the moor, read the clan grave markers, stand in the cold wind, and try to imagine what it felt like to charge into grapeshot on ground your own officers told you was suicidal. The visitor center is thoughtful and unflinching about what happened both during and after the battle. The Jacobite cause itself underwent a strange transformation in the centuries after Culloden. The very culture that the government had tried to stamp out, the tartan, the pipes, the Highland aesthetic, was romantically revived, partly through the influence of Robert Burns and above all through the extraordinary popular success of Sir Walter Scott's novels. When King George IV visited Scotland in 1822, in an event stage-managed by Scott, he appeared in a kilt. The Highland aesthetic, which had been literally illegal within living memory, became the defining symbol of Scottish national identity. There is a profound and melancholy irony in that. The culture of the people who had been cleared, suppressed, and scattered became a romantic costume worn by the society that had cleared and suppressed them. Bonnie Prince Charlie himself has become myth more than man, the dashing, doomed prince whose portrait hangs on walls and whose memory toasts are drunk with secret signs and hidden glasses at the end of the 1700s. The reality was grimmer, a reckless young man who gambled with other people's lives and lost, who spent his remaining decades in exile and decline, having achieved nothing except the destruction of the culture that had supported him. The people who followed him, who charged across that moor in the cold April dawn, who sheltered him at the risk of their own lives and said nothing for £30,000, they deserve to be remembered with something more than a romantic myth. They were fighting, in their own way, for a world and a way of life that they could feel slipping away. They lost, and a slipping away continued, faster and more completely than any of them could have imagined. Culloden Moor is a quiet place now. The wind moves across the heather. The grave markers stand where men fell. And in that silence, if you listen carefully enough, the whole weight of what happened there and what happened because of it is still present. If you found this video interesting, please subscribe and hit the bell. There's much more history waiting for you.